On this Ask Dan Schneider, I'm answering a question from John F. Moore. And he basically asks, it's not really a question, he asked me to recommend 10 or 20 books or works of published poetry. Well, I thought about it, and I don't know if I would recommend books per se, but I would recommend to John or any other listener out there to go to my Cosmoetica website. And on the bottom of the main page, you'll see a link to poetry. So if you go to cosmoetica.com/poetrylinks.htm, you will get a link to the different links to poetry on Cosmoetica. And amongst the pages I have there, I have my own pages of my own poems, poetry essay poems, the Thistle poem, Seek and Destroys. I have quality poets linked to various pages. And then I also have things like my wife's poetry, Jessica Schneider, the Uptown Poetry Group, poetry of people that I knew, Verse Magnifique, some good quality poems people have sent me in, my Hall of Shame for poets, and as well four pages of neglected poets poems from the letters A to F, G to L, M to R, and S to Z. If you click on those links, you will get to those pages. So let me just go page by page and just read off some of the names of the poets that I would recommend and why. On the A to F page, I talk about Conrad Aiken, Bella Akmadalina, Rosario Castellanos, Jane Cooper, Joseph Seaman Carter Jr., Stephen Crane, County Cullen, Marceline DeBord Valmore, James Emanuel, Judith Fitzgerald, Hildegard Flanner, and Robert Francis. I would recommend all of those poets to be read. These poets are not all great poets, but they're usually, I would say, quality poets. If I were to pick of the list that I read on that first page, I would say Joseph Seaman Carter Jr. is an interesting read because he was a black poet who served in World War I for the Americans. And although the British poets have, their generation of World War I poets, Wilfred Owen and so forth, Sassoon, Siegfried Sassoon, and a few others, Carter is probably the closest thing you get in America to that. He was a black poet, but he wasn't necessarily writing about black topics, for example. But his stuff had a power. I have two of his poems listed there, Rain Music and Out of the Shadows. I do have a book of his own poems. I would recommend people getting that. Stephen Crane, is most famous for the Red Badge of Courage in his prose. He wrote what he called lines, which are usually between 5 and 10 lines of verse that's unrhymed. It's free verse, and it's quite radical even today. They're moralistic in a sense, but not in the heavy-handed sense. They are certainly interesting to check out. County Cullen was one of the three great 20th century lyricists, along with E. Cummings. I would put E. Cummings and Edna St. Vincent Millay and County Cullen, the three great lyrical poets, published poets of the 20th century. Cullen was a black homosexual, and he was also one of the great religious poets. He's probably, I would argue, the greatest religious poet America has produced. He's up there with Gerard Manley Hopkins and John Donne in his devotionals, and this is coming from a non-religious person myself. The other two that I would recommend, of course, are James Emanuel. I've promoted James Emanuel's work throughout Cosmoetica, through some of my videos and my Omniversica radio show. He was an underrated poet. I wouldn't put him in the absolute top tier of great poets, pantheon great, but he's great, simply because he didn't have as large a purview as some of the really great poets that were published. And so that's who I would recommend from the A to F page. On the G to L page, I list David George, Samuel Greenberg, Hazel Hall, Robert Hayden, H.D., Nazim Hikmet, Vicente Huidobro, Robinson Jeffers, Stephen Jonas, Weldon Keys, Kate Light, Dwayne Locke, Amy Lowell, and Mina Loy. Of those, the biggest names, the best of the poets there would be Robert Hayden, a black poet who, again, wasn't obsessed with his blackness, although he wrote some of the best black poetry going, in the sense that he didn't write it from a point of victimization. There was an intellect behind it. Nazim Hikmet, famous Turkish poet, someone who I've only got one book of, been able to find, but his stuff was really great. Robinson Jeffers, one of the giants of American poetry, underrated for many years because of his beliefs against World War II. Weldon Keys, a poet who had a lot of potential, mysteriously disappeared. So those are the ones I would recommend from the G to L page. Moving on the M to R page, I list Gwendolyn McEwen, Archibald MacLeish, Osip Mandelstam, Glenn Maxwell, E.L. Mayo, Tom McGrath, Claude McKay, Thilius Moss, John G. Neihart, Lorin Neidecker, Kenneth Patchen, Chaim Plutzik, Jessica Powers, Jeremy Reed, Laura Riding, and Edwin Rolfe. Of those poets, Archibald MacLeish is an interesting poet. He was a big name poet in the 20s and 30s, almost on a par with Pound and Eliot. He wrote a long poem called Conquistador, which has moments. His stuff was always well wrought, if not deeply visionary. Osip Mandelstam, the famed Russian, is one of these poets I consider translator proof. His stuff, no matter who I read it from, shines in as great, which, other poets like Boris Pasternak, that's not really so. It's just an amazing thing. Tom McGrath was one of the red poets of the 1930s and 40s, and some of his verse is tinged by a lot of his sort of cringeworthy political beliefs, but he did write some great poems himself. John G. Neihart, The Western Cycle of Poems, most famous for Black Elk Speaks, but he wrote old-fashioned seeming poems about the Old West. They're better than are given credit for, and I would read him, all his works, poetry and prose. Lorin Neidecker wrote small little verses. She's probably the closest equivalent to a 20th century Emily Dickinson, and in some ways even better than Dickinson. Kenneth Patchen, one of the great oratory poets. If you want to read soliloquies or monologues, he's right up there with Shakespeare. If you took out, 24 of Shakespeare's plays, monologues, they could stand alone as poems. Kenneth Patchen writes poems that stand alone without anything around them. So that's who I would recommend from that page. And on my final and fourth page, I list the S to Z page, I list Carl Sandburg, William Seaton, Kenneth Slessor, Stevie Smith, Billy Marshall Stone King, Shintaro Tanakawa, George Trackle, Marina Tsvetaeva, Hone Tawari, Mark Van Doren, Margaret Walker, Sander Vayoris, Rogan White Nails, and Judith Wright. The best of those would be Carl Sandburg, whose work has been unfortunately slagged upon, greatly famous in his day. After he died, he was sort of poo-pooed as a regionalist, a sentimentalist, and all that kind of stuff. But Sandburg really was a great poet, better than Pound or Eliot. His four preludes on Playthings of the Winds puts to shame anything that Eliot or Pound ever did in that despairing high modernist tone. Shintaro Tanakawa, one of the best Japanese poets. George Trackle, an underrated poet, not quite as good as Rainer Maria Rilke, but I would read him too. And actually, his name is pronounced George Trackle, not Georg, even though it's spelled Georg. It's not Georg, it's George Trackle. Marina Tsvetaeva, probably the best Russian poetess, female poet of the 20th century, much better than Anna Akhmatova, the most famous one. Mark Van Doren is a very underrated poet. He was a poet who wrote verse and poetry that was generally formalist, but very tight. And it's odd because in his smaller book of poems that I have of his like selected poems of 70 or 80, it's a good solid book, but you see how excellent he was in his complete or collected poems that I have. Once you get to 900 or 1,000 of his poems, you see just how rigorously and scrupulously good he was. Maybe not a great poet, but an excellent poet at his best. And the final one I would mention is Judith Wright, the female Australian poet, probably the best poet that I know from Australia. Kenneth Slessor, I mentioned also on this page, is an excellent poet, but I give the edge to Wright. She is, along with, I'd say, Sylvia Plath and Marina Tsvetaeva, probably one of the three best published female poets of the 20th century. There might be a couple of others I toss in at their level, but Wright is really underrated, and she had a way of distancing herself. She wasn't emotional, she wasn't sentimental. She wrote in a very masculine way, but totally different from the masculine way that Plath wrote. So there's my recommendations of poets to read. It's probably what, about 10 on each, and maybe there's 35, 40 poets on the 4 pages combined, and there's a dozen or so, maybe 15 that I would recommend reading up more. Thanks for your question.